Hello, welcome, please come in. Our journey through Psychic-type Pokemon runs is completed, and we arrive here, at the summary video to wrap up this whole series. I was really excited for this series. Psychic has always been one of my favorite types, and seeing how it changed over the years was really fun. I mean, part of the reasons it was one of my favorite types is probably because of how strong it was in the early Pokemon games that came out when I was a child, but hey, that's fine. One type has to be the best, and I'm okay with that being Psychic types. But there's no more preamble, let's hop right into the video. But before we discuss difficulty, we're going to hone in on the Psychic type. How do its type matchups work? Why was it so good in early games? Why is it so fine now? Because Psychic type has definitely dropped. Other really good early types are still really good. Dragon may no longer be king, but it's still near the top. Steel is still the best defensive typing that should ever exist. Fairy is a latecomer that is interestingly balanced. So, what is the Psychic type doing, and why did it fail to maintain that power? Well, let's start in Gen 1. Yes, I know our playthroughs didn't go to Gen 1, but that is why we have the Gen 3 remakes for footage purposes. Psychic was only weak to two types in Gen 1, Bug and Ghost. But, as many people know, due to what is assumed to be a coding error, Psychic type is actually immune to Ghost type moves. I've often seen this error brought up as though it's hugely impactful on the type matchup, but frankly, it just isn't. The only Ghost-type move impacted by type effectiveness is Lick, which has a pitiful attack power of 30. Except no, it doesn't, because apparently Lick got a buff at some point, because in Gen 1, Lick had a power of 20. You could have made Psychic 4 times weak to Ghost, and it simply would not have mattered. Especially because they made the only Ghost-type Pokemon line Poison Ghost, so they're weak to Psychic moves anyway. So no stab Lick for you. And the only other Pokemon that learns Lick in Gen 1 is Jinx. Yes, that is correct. Lickitung cannot learn Lick in Gen 1. But let's move on, because if I start getting into everything wrong with Gen 1, that's going to be the whole video. The weakness to Bug is also basically irrelevant. Here's a list of every Bug-type move in Gen 1 per Cerebi.net. And you may notice, these are terrible. I mean, it's a bit misleading because Pin Missile and Twin Needle can hit multiple times, but even if every attack hits the maximum number of times, the highest base power you can get is 60 with Pin Missile. And the only Bug-type Pokemon that can learn Pin Missile in Gen 1 is Beedrill, which is awful, and a Poison type, so Psychic is super effective against it. And yeah, there are really strong Bug types in Pinsir and Scyther. Neither can actually learn any Bug moves though, probably because all the Bug moves are awful. So, as you can see, defensively, nothing could really touch Psychic types. The offensive side is kind of less favorable. Psychic type moves hit Poison for super effective damage, which is a very prominent type in Gen 1. And the super effective hits on Fighting were fine, but Fighting was pretty trash in Gen 1, so it's actually not that relevant. One of Psychic's real strengths, though, was that only Psychic-type Pokemon resisted it. That meant strong Psychic-type attacks could hit most Pokemon for at least neutral damage. And when that neutral damage is a 90 base power move from a Pokemon with 135 in special, things often died. Anyway, enough on Gen 1, we move into Gen 2, and the flip is fast and unpleasant. First up, the special stat is split into special attack and special defense. This means most Psychic types got weaker just on a stat basis. Alakazam went from 135 special defense to 85. Still fine, but no longer comical. And that was just the start. Gen 2 also introduced Steel types, which, in addition to resisting probably more types than it should, resisted Psychic type moves, serving as an effective wall against Psychic type, and many other types. Steel type's introduction hurt Psychic, but it wasn't the worst. The worst was the newly introduced Dark type, which could not only hit Psychic type for super effective damage, but was fully immune to Psychic type attacks. There are not many immunities in Pokemon, and when they are hugely impactful. And this was no different. Dark types can absolutely shred through Psychic Pokemon. It also doesn't help that Dark type moves like Bite and Crunch are very common on non-Dark type Pokemon, meaning the introduction of Dark type attacking moves really did a lot to make the already fairly frail Psychic types even more punchable. And that was Gen 2 really screwing things up for Psychic types. Gen 3 Kanto is mostly unaffected because there are no Dark types in Kanto, hence why I played that as the first game, but there were big hits. The next neutral adjacent thing was the physical special split. This change in Gen 4 is really a mixed bag depending on what moves a Pokemon learned, what their highest attacking stat was, etc. Jinx, for example, really got screwed over by the change because Ice Punch was really strong in Gen 3 when it used Jinx's great special attack, but is garbage in Gen 4 when it uses its much worse attack stat. But now that we've largely established what happened here, let's hop back to the first game and start talking about difficulty. And the first game on the list is LeafGreen, and this goes into the lowest ranking. Psychic types are real good in Kanto, regardless of which generation it is. I recall that the only fight even worth really talking about was the rival fight in Cerulean City, and that's really just because I had to solo it with a single Drowsy that I was trying to keep from overleveling. Every single fight after that was a joke. Psychic types are just so strong in this game. Having neutral matchups against every gym except Koga, and you might think, all neutral matchups, that's not good. And you would often be right, but even neutral hits can deal huge chunks of damage when every Pokemon in your team has a strong Psychic type attack, and has a comically high special attack. I'm trying to remember if there were any encounters of note in this game after I got a second Pokemon. Was Sabrina difficult? No, right? Anyway, for all the reasons I talked about above, Psychic types just cannot be stopped at all in this game. It's really very funny. And then we get to SoulSilver, which brings in all the nerfs that came with Gen 2, and the complication of the special physical split. And this game gets the top slot very easily. And the problems for this were in two parts. First up was the lack of early game Psychic types. Slowpoke is surprisingly good, and it learning Curse right out the gate was very useful for the first few gyms, but trying to solo a much better team with just a Slowpoke was rough. Once I could get past the rival in Azalea Town, it did open up with Abra, Drowsy, and the sleeper MVP Execute, but there were still problems. Jasmine Steel types were a big issue, that Steel type defensively is real rough, and most gyms managed to at least make a show of things. Even Claire was pretty tough until I brought in my Girafarig with Thunder. And then the real stars of the difficulty matchup, the Elite Four. I knew the Elite Four would be difficult going into it. Poison, Psychic, Fighting, and Dark. I was really expecting 2 easy trainers, a difficult trainer, and a Nightmare. And I was close, but turns out even the Poison-type Elite Four member managed to hold his own. Seriously, Koga was a one-shot sweep in the last game. Not really sure what happened to turn him into this mess. And that Karen fight was awful. Gen 4 move pools aren't nearly as diverse as I'm kind of used to from modern Pokemon games. And while in a modern game, a lot of Pokemon could learn a Fairy-type coverage move, that is not an option here. My best bet was finding something to get in a neutral hit, with no stab because of the Psychic-type immunity. I mean, my actual best option was to drop an Exeggutor to throw out Leech Seed and sleep. It really started to feel like all my Pokemon being Psychic-type was just a detriment, with secondary typings being way more useful. And while Espeon is my favorite evolution, it's actually slower and has a lower special attack and speed than my favorite boy Alakazam, which, along with not getting Psychic until so late in its level up pool, makes it a much worse sweeper than I would prefer. So yes, shocker of shocks, the remake of the generation that nerfed Psychic types the hardest is actually really difficult for Psychic types to deal with, which was not at all surprising. To be fair, Gen 4 Pokemon games also tend to be the hardest anyway, just because of how the designers balance them. And finally, we reach the current generation, and it gets to slide into the middle difficulty slot, which isn't super surprising. Psychic types have fallen pretty far from the peak, but Violet also has so many ways to compensate for that. The pool of Pokemon to choose from is comically large. I didn't even bother accessing either of the DLC areas because I had too many Psychic types as it was. Then there is the slow creep of improved move pools for every single Pokemon. Every Pokemon can learn just such a huge variety of moves, whether through level up or TM, to cover a lot more situations than they could have in the early generations. And of course, Terastallization, the powerful gift of just ignoring the challenge entirely by making one Pokemon whatever type I wanted that wasn't Psychic type. Gardevoir as a full Fairy type, Armouge as a full Fire type. Collecting enough Terra Shards to change any of my Pokemon's Terra type is way too tedious to bother with in this series, but even just default types can be useful for dual type Pokemon. There were still a few fights that were more difficult. Iono was a pain to get through thanks to her scary Mismagius. Tulip was surprisingly scary with her Psychic types. I guess I really didn't have as much Dark coverage going into that fight as I probably should have, but a lot of fights made Psychic feel irrelevant, I guess? Fighting and Poison are only used by the Team Star fights, which I don't do because I don't want to. Dark is also locked behind Team Star. Bug is technically a gym, but getting Armors as early as I did made that completely meaningless. So Pokemon Violet was pretty easy, but that's mostly because Psychic type wasn't really that impactful, and I had a wide enough pool of secondary typings that I could just lean on those to deal with most of the threats the game threw at me. Still wasn't as easy as LeafGreen though. And then we arrive at the coveted recommended discussion, and our first game, LeafGreen. And this decision is actually really difficult. Each of these games has a very different mixture of what works and what doesn't, and what's fun. so it is a bit of a challenge by itself to just rank these, but I think I'm going to place LeafGreen in second place. So let's talk about the downsides first. The early game is pretty boring until you get past Nugget Bridge. Drowsy is a fine enough Pokemon for the early game, but it's all you can get until you can catch an Abra and trade for a Mr. Mime, which does make the rival fight in Cerulean City more annoying than difficult. You also have a pretty limited pool of Pokemon to choose from. I used all of them. I think it was all of them. So there isn't a ton of variety that I haven't explored in this video. Though note, you do need to do this run in LeafGreen rather than Fire Red because 2 Pokemon... I never used Slowbro, that's right. Anyway, Slowbro and Starmie are version exclusives for some reason. Not sure why they put both Water Psychic Pokemon in the same version, but whatever. The run is also not particularly challenging. In fact, it's pretty light, pretty breezy, which does move directly into the good points. And the first is that it's not particularly challenging, because sometimes you just want to do something different for a replay through a game, and you don't need or want it to be that difficult. And Psychic types are a quick and easy run, and if that's what you want, it's definitely good for it. All this combines into a pretty easy recommendation from me. Go have fun, slaughter your Poison-type foes with waves of Psychic. It won't take very long. Next on the list is SoulSilver, and this game is going to earn last place. SoulSilver is awkward for this challenge. In fact, I spent a lot of time trying to decide which game to serve as the midpoint in this series, and there aren't actually a ton of options. Pokemon really wants to gate Psychic-type Pokemon until the mid-game, but SoulSilver had never been on the channel before, and it was the remake of Gen 2, where everything turned on Psychic types. The downsides to Gen 2 is that a lot of the Pokemon are the same. Gen 2 is a pretty small addition to the Pokedex. It's not the smallest, but it's not that many additional Pokemon. And because it's only the second generation, it really has to lean on that Gen 1 Pokedex pretty heavily, which can make a playthrough of SoulSilver feel very familiar to someone who has just done a Gen 1 playthrough, and often not in a good way. Only half the gym leaders have a Gen 2 Pokemon at all, and you don't even see one until the 3rd gym. The other big mark against it is that there's a whole second set of gym leaders when you revisit Kanto. I noped out of that because I didn't want to do it, it would have taken a while, but if you are more completionist than me, you may run into a time issue with how long and awkwardly paced this game can be. And while this game was more difficult than the other two, that difficulty is really backloaded, with most of the difficult fights being Claire and the Elite Four, who are kind of awful to deal with. I only won those fights because I was getting carried by Exeggutor, who was absolutely repping its grass type more than its psychic type. And if this sounds negative, it is, kind of. But to be clear, I would still recommend this challenge, and if you want to do it, go for it. It was mostly fun. I'm just focusing on the negative a bit to explain why it placed as low as it did, not to say that the run was fundamentally awful or something. And then came Violet, earning the top slot, because while it was close with all 3 games, Violet just managed to edge out the competition, and that comes down to a few factors. First is that Violet always gets points for the streamlining of the gym fights. It really feels a lot more like a boss rush than in the other games, which is way more fun for doing these sorts of challenge runs. It does come with the downside of no rare candy treats and a speed up, but, you know, swings and roundabouts. There are also a lot of Pokemon to choose from. I dropped 3 or 4 Pokemon just in my playthrough, and there are others I just never caught. I didn't even bother with the DLC. And one thing I really like about Gen 9 is how many different Pokemon there are across the board. I've never really given that much thought to Medicham, but then I used it here and saw the frankly bonkers offensive coverage it learns. Bronzong was a tank who easily earned its place on the team. Violet just does so many things right to give it an edge in recommendation contests. I do wish more of the gyms or Elite Four had meaningful interactions with the Psychic type, positively or negatively, just so that Psychic felt more meaningful, but part of that is Psychic isn't that great of an offensive type to begin with. There was a lot of this run where I didn't really have to think about my Pokemon's main typing at all. Like, how do I deal with all my Pokemon being Psychic type in this water gym? Oh wait, who cares? And the Elite Four in this game are easier than I would expect. Oh well, what can you do? It was a fun run, and I recommend it. Use some Pokemon I didn't. And that is it for Pokemon Psychic types only. And that was a really fun series to do. I really like the Psychic type, so it was interesting to see firsthand how the type has changed across generations. Let me know what monotype series I should do next in the comments. I did want to shout out that I do have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone and will remain that way. For now, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.